Hello, I am Angelyn Spignesi, Coplik Arden, and I will be presenting first my summary of my lyrical analysis of Chapter 8 of Jane Eyre, and then I'll read my synopsis of the chapter, followed by my lyrical analysis. This chapter, Chapter 8, is how not retaliating leads to exoneration, a being released from accusation and or attack. Also, Bronte says Indian for Native American. Actually, she uses it in a very complimentary way, so I'll say that too, quoting her. We left off with Jane being punished, which was Brocklehurst carrying forward Mrs. Reed's accusation. And Jane is sitting on a stool for half an hour, and then he commanded that no one speak to her for the remainder of the day. When Jane is alone, without Helen's gaze sustaining her, there are no words for her shame, and she begins to react. Brocklehurst's attack is in her head, and she wants to die. Looking into Helen's eyes, Jane thought she could leave the stepmother's curse. But now, falling to the floor weeping, she begins returning to a fusion with Mrs. Reed's unconscious in a red room wish to die. Now, this dissolving, dissolution, is part of the process of leaving the old self. And yet, without accompaniment by another and dialogue, it will turn into the old hysteria. So weeping can turn into either hysteria or interior suffering, and Helen Burns enters. Helen is breaking out of Brocklehurst's command here not to speak with Jane. Helen sits silently by Jane's grieving and then speaks with her. So the Brocklehurst fall, or depotentiation, begun by Miss Temple's marble response to him, continues with Helen's lessons to Jane here. Helen sits still by Jane's grief, quote, silent as an Indian, end quote, allied with the deep muteness of ages, resonant to hold the meaning of most hollowed grief. The Reed and Brocklehurst forces provoked reaction, as we've seen, but they do not transform through suffering. Helen's accompanying Jane resonates to true suffering, so Jane's first impulsive reaction to die moves to a dialogue to find the meaning inherent in the suffering. And in this dialogue, Helen trims Brocklehurst's doom, slicing through and trimming the negative inflation of Brocklehurst. She says not all witnessed the attack, only 80 students who pity more than despise Jane. Also, Brocklehurst is not a god. Helen's return to Jane with coffee and bread is a valuing of the interiorization of suffering instead of acting it out, the Gateshead mode of reacting blatantly and impulsively. Their dialogue explores the meaning of the suffering through its figures. We have Mr. Brocklehurst, we have the student body as audience, we have kingdom of spirits, and we have conscience. Helen's coffee and bread teaches through appetite as well. Now, this is the appetite for which Miss Temple had stood, which was part of Brocklehurst's depotentiation, and which becomes here also a teaching of conscience. When Brocklehurst, who is the exterior rigid moralizer, is lowered, then you find conscience. Still rising through body, Helen condenses, taking Jane back to the human. Her lessons begin with a move deeper into interior suffering, speaking its meaning in a related manner. Mr. Lloyd was a precursor to such, you might remember, which is why he was the catalyst to going to Lowood. Helen teaches that conscience is friend and is more important than external approval. As Helen is teaching Jane that conscience is friend, Jane senses a, quote, inexpressible sadness, end quote, in her companion, who then coughs. Helen rises to angels and core wisdom, yet she does not return that to body, which holds a sadness even she cannot express. Jane has concern for Helen and puts her arms around her waist, and Miss Temple enters. So Miss Temple is the place where rising up to the higher intelligence also needs to embrace a way back to body and relatedness. After Helen's lessons of trimming the inflated negativity and reactivity, she teaches how conscience is guide. And Jane then is able to speak with Miss Temple, going over her history in a way that is regulated, temperate, and true. It is a place of seed cake, food of the departed souls, the ancestors, ancient instruction. To find the conscience in the temple is to work from the heart, which is a matter of serving the appetite, so it resonates with souls of the departed, their lessons. The conversation between Helen and Miss Temple that ensues is illuminated and enlightening. So tempering reactivity, not retaliating, but finding the narrative in what was unconscious, rises you to a luminous intelligence, allowing you to find your gift. Temptations of idolatry appear as women find the right ways of conspiring their unique intelligences. Helen's cough comes at the moment when the female mentor cannot submit to the emergence of the student's suffering, yet reverts to a paternal reading, a reading of Virgil. And in this section, I do a reading of Virgil's work, the Aeneid, to illustrate this. The unconscious body not attended results in teachers scattered, punishing the body. Wrong, forced, friction. How to manifest the gift you find in the temple. Your gift is a lesson of a passage back down through body, which is to find the place of the figures you delineated in your unconscious when you rose from impulse to companion narration, and manifest that through body in the world. So here is a secondary condensation, which is an incarnation. Moving gift out through the body again brings up the Brocklehurst rigid prohibition of body as vile, as disease. And you have to have the resistance to pass through this disease to carry out your gift. And that brings us to chapter 9. So now I will read my synopsis of chapter 8. Finally the bell, the half an hour over, others go to their tea. Alone I descend, face to floor, wetting that floor grief. What was supported dissolves, replaced by reaction. Quote, now I wept, Helen Burns was not here, nothing sustained me. Left to myself, I abandoned myself, and my tears watered the boards, end quote. For I had meant to do well here, earn respect, find friends, and just today to the head of my class I rose. Teacher's praise, Miss Temple's promise that in 2 months to begin the French and learn the drawing from her. Pupils my age no longer are molesting, they're treating me instead as equal. Yet now, laying crushed, it is all over now, and it is to die. I want to die, mumble repetition, then a start. The figure of Helen Burns approaching, it is coffee and bread she carries me in the light of the fading fire. Come eat something. But I push it aside, would only choke. I cannot calm. Perhaps she is surprised at this agitation. I cannot help, and I continue to weep aloud. She sits hugging her knees, silent Indian embrace beside. It is my voice asking how can she sit so close to what all believe to be a liar. Only 80 heard it, she says, whereas the world contains hundreds of millions. The 80 despise me. No, more it is a pity. But after the words of Brocklehurst, he's not a god or even an admired man. He never strove for our affection. Had he singled you as favorite, then you would have had enemies here. Instead, now, if they dared, they would offer sympathy. And if you continue to do well, the friendly feeling again will appear, only now temporarily concealed. Besides, Jane. Well, Helen? And I place my hand in hers. Chafing, she warms my fingers and begins in a low voice. She is saying, if all the world hated me, yet my conscience approved me and absolved me from guilt, then I would not be without friends. No, I cannot tolerate to be, quote, solitary and hated, end quote. For to get an affection from her or Miss Temple or anyone who I truly loved, I would do anything, have my arm broken, let the hoof of the kicking horse smash my chest. Hush. Too vehement and impulsive I am, she says, and I think too much of the love of human beings. For there are resources beside my, quote, feeble self, end quote. And she begins telling me of another world besides this race of humans, invisible world of spirits watching, guarding, and if we lay dying with only scorn all around us, these angels see our torture, our innocence. If it be so, and she knows I am innocent, for she read it in my ardent eyes, my clear front. And she continues, with the separation of flesh from spirit, the reward, life so soon passing over to this glory, indeed, the overwhelming distress is not necessary. Her words fall over me, now a calm mixed with a, quote, inexpressible sadness, end quote. I cannot tell where it comes, this sadness. And now she is breathing quickly in a cough. I have concern for her, and my head placed on her shoulder, arms around her waist. She draws me to her. We sit in the silence, clouds shift, and that moon shining full moon through this window upon us, and embrace as upon this figure approaching us, Miss Temple. She wants me in her room, and since Helen also is here, she may come. Threading, quote, intricate passages, end quote, and one last staircase mounted, we arrive, and that woman sits, Helen, and then places me by her side. Have I cried the grief away? Never. All will see me now wicked. Not so, she says. It is more how I prove myself to be. Continue to do well, and she will be satisfied. And she asked my story on this, Mrs. Reed. Did she adopt me of her own accord? She wants to know my story without exaggeration. I remember Helen's caution on, quote, indulgence of resentment, end quote. Also, I am so exhausted that the story is more moderate, less gall, and thus more credible. Miss Temple hears. She says she has heard of this Mr. Lloyd. She will write. His corroboration will be my public exoneration. And to her, I am clear now. A kiss. Then she inquires on Helen's cough, takes her pulse. She sighs low and pensive until she rings for tea and toast. Toast, however, sent by the housekeeper strictly within the usual portion. Toast for one, not enough. The teacher smiles. She has it in her, quote, power to supply deficiencies for this once, end quote. In a drawer, unlocked, it is a seed cake. Slices cut by generous hand, a feast, quote, as on nectar and ambrosia, end quote. Then by the fire, each of us placed on either side of her, there follows a conversation between her and Helen. In its hearing, I am privileged. Always around Miss Temple is the serenity, quote, refined propriety in her language, which precluded deviation into the ardent, the excited, the eager, something which chastened the pleasure of those who looked on her and listened to her, by a controlling sense of awe. And such was my feeling now. But as to Helen Burns, I was struck by wonder, end quote. For the first time, her cheek has color stimulated somewhat by the meal here with the instructress beloved, but more through powers of her, quote, own unique mind, end quote, also shining in her eyes, acquiring, quote, a beauty more singular than that of Miss Temple's, end quote, a beauty, quote, of meaning, of movement, of radiance. Then her soul sat on her lips, and language flowed from what source I cannot tell. Has a girl of 14 a heart large enough, vigorous enough to hold the swelling spring of pure, full, fervid eloquence, end quote. How many books they speak of, and here are countries of afar, and facts of nations, time past, and secrets of nature, and the language and authors of French. I am amazed, and this amazement to its climax when Helen is reading Virgil for this teacher has asked, can she recall the Latin taught her by her father? The bell. Miss Temple holds Helen longer, sad sigh, and carefully follows her with an eye tearing as we go to the door and depart. At the bedroom, Miss Scatcherd is scrutinizing the drawers. Helen, reprimanded, murmurs to me her things were of disorder she had forgotten. The next day, a pasteboard bearing the word slattern bound on her forehead. She wears it unresentful, as though deserving. Yet the moment the teacher departs, I am running to Helen and tearing that despicable sign and thrusting it into the fire. Quote, the fury of which she was incapable had been burning in my soul all day, and tears, hot and large, had continually been scalding my cheek, for the spectacle of her sad resignation gave me an intolerable pain at the heart, end quote. In a week, it is Mr. Lloyd's response corroborating my account. Miss Temple clears me publicly from the charge. The class congratulates, kisses, murmur of pleasure through it. I set out to learn, work diligently then, improving the memory, advancing until one day, in less than 2 months, I am allowed the lesson of drawing and also French. And that night it is not food, as usual in my imagination. Right before sleep, not those cravings fancied, but instead the future drawings, all of my hand. Here trees, butterflies and roses, birds at cherries, wren's nests wreathed by ivy, these the feast. Lowood's privation feast, and never would I prefer the Gateshead luxury. And that ends my synopsis of Chapter 8. And now I will read parts of my lyrical analysis of the chapter in a way that maintains its consistency. Quote from the text, the spell by which I had been so far supported began to dissolve. Reaction took place, and soon, so overwhelming was the grief that seized me, I sank prostrate with my face to the ground, end quote from Jane Eyre. Dissolve. Our reaction is to inflate what is negation. We are nothing, all is lost. In the Helen absence, Brocklehurst's negative inflation is the only thing. We are only reaction. Makes us sink. His grandiosity becomes the hyperbole of our doom, repeated statements of death wish. We are nothing, all is lost, never respect from others. Without interior reflecting, which was sensation rise sublime, gets stopped, and all is empty, not to language it, yet react, which is to split again and see ourselves as nothing from the public eye, which is the Brocklehurst split, which is the Mrs. Reed curse. We are nothing is to become the public view, viewing us, to shun us, outcast, when what was interior, that saw and promise of delineation, is gone, we reverse to the Gateshead curse. His voice is our sinking in ardent whining, red room wish to die. We sought to sublime that curse, and perhaps in our shedding of the Gateshead impulse layers, we sought to shed that aunt. We were looking into the great girl's eyes, and we thought we could leave that curse. But she leaves, he swoops back. Curse catches us. Our unconscious rising is a lie, cannot be reflected in message. We totter, we fall off our stool, agitation of feeling locked in what is empty of human. We are shaking that locked door of the red room again, stepmother curse, drowning in the old regorging. We are in some vacant room, and we are shaking the locked door, sound in our head, frenzied dissent, curse of we cannot go forward without her. And she proclaims unconscious lie. Collapsed, ministerial cracking whip self-torments. We return to humiliation at the foot of our stepmother. Our fall to the floor is our running to that stepmother, fuse again with her body, to be a body, only way we have known ourselves is nothing, to be all of her, especially unconscious. Our fall to the floor is the running to that stepmother through her Brocklehurst. As we fall to the floor, tears to those boards, we are returning to her. As we return to her, we are nothing. Her male agents and our impulse reaction as and against them has always been the way back into her. And familiar now, we grasp her coming man, Brocklehurst. We slip Seized, we see ourselves from the condemning public eye. Is our reaction a dissolution? The girl returns when he resides within what was most intimate. We start at her step, and looking up, we see by the fading fire that she carries coffee and bread. What allows her to come back, as we are losing ourselves in his grip, is a suffering, our loss of appetite. She remembers and carries a simple food back to us. That she has held us interior and exterior absence and returns with a concrete manifestation, indicating not only that she remembered who we are, but what the place is like and what we may require in it. She suffers it together with us, without becoming our suffering, passions it together with us, and her compassionate memory becomes presence which holds us, for we have been sinking in an old regorging. Suffering begins to bring us where we are low in. The reed and Brocklehurst forces provoke reaction, burst from inertia, but do not transform through suffering. John Reed in our head within the red room was self-pity, a whining when the capacity of suffering not yet possible. Lowood has Brocklehurst in our head, an agitated worry of public view, public condemnation. His temptation of negative inflation keeps us under waves, rising now exterior and crashing upon us. To receive Helen in this place entails risking a different relation to these waves, for we begin to see she has not returned to lift us away from them, yet more to let them through informing, not falling flat in catastrophe, yet slow, companioned descent. Because there is a presence there, we trust, who sits solidly, because she sits beside. And though we have expected to surprise or worry her with our agitation, we find she settles into it. We still. And we see we can go further into this abyss of the winds had been churning, tunneling descent, neck bowed and then snapped forward, rivers from sockets flooding lap, stomach pulling out its torrent, and here she is again, slower now, cries becoming a heaving grief. This grief had been locked beneath the Gateshead outburst and seizure. With her alongside, we sink into what had been covered by obsession or seizure exterior. She does not speak for us here. No coercion of what begins as agitation. No compromise or patronize of this place, nor emerged release, instead beside planted. Helen sits down in it, silent as an Indian. She sits low with us in the deep dusk of the red-brown silence of soil, containing the heavy muteness of ages, resonant enough to hold the moanings, the eternal chant of the most hallowed grief. Helen's presence alongside Jane allows Jane to descend, not in the Brocklehurst mode, whining exterior stance, but through a grief well suffering it. The sensations had rose to her passing gaze, their language a rhythm of grief which becomes condensed, not through impulse reaction, yet suffering, word, related. Jane speaks first, wonders how Helen can sit so closely. What would it be to return his critical stance to the unconscious forces, distinguishing their elements as we stay related to them, neither split nor drowning? Helen returns, and our words are this way we are different, and yet still in relation. Jane asks Helen, how can you sit so closely to one whom all believe liar? Her question itself threatens the Brocklehurst doom, an inflation now negative, which is the underside of his pomposity, his split. Everyone sees her mark. Everyone despises her. Helen's response, clear and distinct, cuts through the Brocklehurst inflation. 80 people, not everyone, not an entire world of hundreds of millions. 80 people who do not despise. More, it is a pity. The Helen mode is analysis from perspective, her gaze of high, angelic. She trims, pairs the flagrant catastrophizing and projection. So to move through Brocklehurst, learn severance yet still remain related, is to address the negatively inflated thought with statements succinct. And in this precise addressing, Helen condenses. She says he is not a god. She takes us back to the human, saying he even is not a great or admired human. She takes us back to the human through a laconic translation, which condenses as it holds. We give her our hand. Coffee and bread in the hand, same hand, it holds our chafing heat, soothing exchange through the palms placed one upon the other as fingers curl their touch, elaborately simple. It warms. It says, my heat also yours, you are not too much for me, and I too have something to impart. When the forces seemed only external and besieging tossed, we had no sense of distinctive voice. Now she sits beside and speaks of conscience. We do not want to know it, yet we want her hand chafing ours. We would be abused for her love, the love of Miss Temple. Helen teaching us of the angels as she holds our hand, and we feel its heat as she calls us too impulsive and vehement. She is speaking of realms of angels, seeing our tortures, spirits abounding, through them our justice, later glory. Look to the angel friend, conscience as friend. Our compulsion is being condensed by Helen, now to conscience, and when we return in conscience, a concern for her body, downward teachings now, conscience returning embodied as a cloud shifts, human haze shows a woman walking toward our embrace. Miss Temple is looking into us and asks, have we cried away our grief? Her residence at the intimate grief's chamber, and she appears to take us through intricate passages to the heart of the matter. She wants to know, what is the Gateshead story? We speak our narrative clearly. We had been seized by the John Reed and Mr. Reed forces. We have thrashed, and we have been seized again. They have come when we were engaging in the recessed chambers, often read, also of our mothers. Now this quiet chamber of a temple, mosaic echoes, less fair here, sanctified place where the edge of our story takes some residence and does not turn back on us. Miss Temple is where the heart has a capacity to understand that the aunt did not choose us of her own accord. We pass the story of aunt's revulsion for Red Room child through us, and we remain standing. This way, the descent of father's law into the blood forces that were recessed becomes conscience and dialogue with the words, narrative of that recess. Occurs through friend caring. She sat by heart, delivered us to Temple with an ethics for the contradictions of where we have been rent. Miss Temple says to Jane, she will write to Mr. Lloyd upon his corroboration. She will be publicly cleared. Miss Temple says to Jane, she is clear now to her. Mr. Lloyd for hire agreement, the public exoneration. Who is the authority to which conscience resorts for public opinion? The girl alongside us coughs. Now I have a lyrical section called Miss Temple's Sigh. Occasionally I would hear her whispering to her angels. Hers is a fervent longing to return to them, just reward. Daily I notice in her walk, her stance and bearing that she is aspiring to them by leaving us. The cough resumes harsher, and I feel it come upon me, winged, rising in my chest and coming in folds, falling down out of my mouth. I release this sigh. Angels not wanting the gift returned to them, yet to know their gift through her flesh of this life, my sigh. I will feed her, lower her to this body, tea and toast, this my plea, my pardon. And now I'll return to the lyrical analysis. Jane and Helen sit at the table, and Miss Temple serves them slices of seed cake. Mystic banquet. We were not expecting it. Just when we had named our Gateshead story and Helen coughed, these ways we have been marked, we begin a dialogue with her, open drawer, and here she is offering us some seed cake. Food of the feasts of the souls departed, For our ancestors, seed cake was the food of the feast of the dead, binding the living to those dead. Eating this cake, they would hear the speaking of souls departed, angels quarreling through what is of grain substance. Seed in a cake, seed shattered, now life extending to hallowed chambers, and the dead, they sing a new instruction. Generous slices, a feast then as on nectar and ambrosia. We are in a temple where through our appetite we summon the voices of the dead, begin the feast of what is their secret nostalgia to return to us. We are very hungry when we arrive. From her drawer, the nourishment is as nectar, and we find ourselves with God speaking through. These invisible forces, now secrets emerging through dialogue exchange, feed us, our appetite satiated. Substance of the messages of all dead, whispering chorals slowly penetrating until our lips move. Some say creativity. More, it is a matter of appetite. The one who is awesome also nourishes. Now we are fed by forces invisible, even long dead, as we have feasted in her temple. Helen and Miss Temple have a conversation by the fire. And then we can go further, pass through the most unlit chambers, ageless secrets, our imagination hungry and fed the seed cake we imagine our way, now the beam of that torch brighter. Our vision begins changing in her room, half lit, illuminations offered, and intuitions form themselves more readily. She is hearing the ancient language it forms in our voice we know, yet not from where in her presence our memory is revived. Breathing better in her chambers, we capture the breezes, carry them up for her. Her sound, her smell, her bearing, the move of her wrists, the way her legs cross, and this way she receives our articulation brings color to our face. There were some rhythms. We had not heard or caught them before, but now we sense them in this atmosphere, circles surrounding, each in its own rhythm, extending to her, received, sent back. As she holds our gaze, we are held within these rings and we are stirred. She stirs us to lost beauty, quote, of meaning, of movement, of radiance, end quote. We are recognizing their archaic designs and those radical chords, and we bring them up for her. We are listening while these two traverse this world's history to its margin of lost nation, ancient mysteries, dust as sheet covering chests, the leather straps broken. They are sounding the manuscripts of ages, ringing through nature's secrets, struck in dialogue. What passions as fervid in Helen is pure eloquence. Now that student is roused and stimulated those sources to a full cheek flush and eyes radiant of meaning, a beauty more singular than that of Miss Temple. Helen, roused in dialogue with beloved teacher, has not made her gift that teacher's, instead asking something from this one serene, from this teacher's propriety, quote, which precluded deviation into the ardent, the excited, the eager, end quote, something asked. Teacher and pupil touch qualities in one another which are yearning to be manifested in each. Woman speaking intelligence, luminous, not pedantic. Two women speaking intelligence. Helen shines off toward Miss Temple in luminescence, not incandescence. Does not absorb that teacher's light. Helen shines toward Miss Temple, and it comes as a sort of radiant beauty, more singular than the teacher's, calling that teacher further to manifest through the girl who loves her some intelligence, fervor, imaginative ardor. Two women dialoguing in intelligence. This teacher is allowing herself to be divested as master, secret conspiration. We find the temptations of idolatry as we learn with woman to conspire in intelligence. Jane's temptation of idolatry has been to locate the gift only upon Miss Temple and Helen as external others. Helen's temptation of idolatry has been to locate the gift only upon invisible angels, not knowing these qualities in embodied manifestation. And Jane is still stuck somewhat in seeing angels as gods. But in Miss Temple's chamber, we are asked to see through our idolatries, and arriving at a singular beauty, Jane witnesses Helen's brilliance roused through Miss Temple's presence without being located upon that woman. Yet Helen, beginning to lower her gift to the human, gets stopped. The next day, Miss Scatcherd binds a pasteboard bearing the word slattern to Helen's forehead. While Helen wears the slattern sign on her forehead, Jane is burning with the rage Helen is incapable of experiencing. Jane finally runs up, rips the sign off, and throws it into the fire. The two carry one another's lesson. But where Jane is taught by Helen to enter other invisible realms, precluding impulsive grasp of the human, and becoming conscience speaking, Helen has not been able to learn the friction permitting her eloquence its bodily design, and neglected body spills to waste, careless, body of the one sublime, now only slattern. Helen has not been able to learn Jane's downward lesson. And here ends the lyrical analysis of Chapter 8. Thank you for listening.